This is the final video in the lecture on perfect competition. So here we're just going to distinguish economic rent from economic profit. It is a more complicated concept where it really requires using that opportunity cost thinking that we stressed in our discussion over Buchanan's cost and choice. Okay. So, and we'll also be relaxing some assumptions of the model that we've been using previously. So as I've discussed throughout the lecture, in the long run for this model, there's no opportunity for economic profit, right? That condition that defines the long run equilibrium for firms in the perfectly competitive market is zero profit. Okay, so that zero profit condition defines this model. When we use it, we assume usually that producers have identical cost curves. But the reality, right, when we think about the world that we actually live in, the reality may be that some firms are going to be more efficient at producing a good than others, right? If you watched the last video, I talked about how in Dalton, Georgia, there's happened to be this clustering of all the carpet producers in the US. And what it's meant is that they can get workers who are much more productive at that particular task than factories that are in other locations, right? Because the concentration of carpet manufacturers in Dalton, Georgia has meant that colleges are providing training specifically for people who want to work in those factories, okay? Meaning that when they get on the factory floor, they're much more efficient than someone who's not had that previous training. In this case, where we do have firms that have different cost curves where they're able to produce at a cheaper cost than their competitors, those more efficient firms are able to earn what we call economic rent, right? And we define this by returns to specialized inputs above what firms paid for them. So for instance, if the workers in Dalton, Georgia, who are hired by those carpet companies are paid the same wage as workers in, say, Arizona who don't have that training but are still producing carpet, those firms are enjoying a much more highly productive labor input than those firms in Arizona are, right? The workers in Dalton, Georgia have already been trained. They already know how to do this really well. Whereas in Arizona, the carpet firms there need to train those workers sort of from the ground up. And so using those workers is much more costly, meaning that they're much less productive given the price that's being paid. Okay. So in that example, the factories in Dalton, Georgia that are producing carpet are earning an economic rent. So as we relax this assumption of all of the firms having identical costs, now we have to think about for whom does that zero profit condition hold in the long run? And the reality is that in the long run, when there are more efficient firms than others, some will be earning a positive profit. What will be important now for defining our long run condition is that firms with the highest marginal cost of producing, those firms that are the least efficient in the production process, are now the only ones earning zero profit, right? They're the ones who show to those firms that haven't yet entered, don't bother. If you do, you're going to make a loss, right? Because the presumption is any firm that's not already in the market has costs equal to or higher than the highest cost producer already serving that industry. One last brief thing on this slide. When we get to the practice problems, we will be doing an example problem where we have firms with different costs of production. So you'll see this play out, right? You'll see that the highest cost producer is the one we identify as earning zero profit. Economic rent generally is included in the opportunity costs associated with the use of an input. So those more productive, more specialized workers in Dalton, Georgia have very high opportunity costs, right? If a company does not pay them for their specialized abilities, they're going to go elsewhere, right? You could also think more generally about someone who's a really excellent manager, right? They're just really good at working with people, getting them motivated, dealing with conflict. That manager might be paid the same as what general managers are in a geographic area, right? But that firm that hires them is benefiting from the excellence, the high ability and quality of a job that that manager can do, meaning that that firm gets economic rents. What's going to happen over time is people are going to recognize how good that manager is, right? The manager likely will recognize how good they are, and demand a higher wage. And if the firm can't provide that, they're going to go elsewhere. And so over time, economic rents tend to be competed away. So with that, this concludes our lecture on the perfectly competitive model. There's going to be one more video going through the practice problems for this chapter, but going forward, we're going to move on to chapter 3, where we see this model applied and look at some specific interventions in the market, notably price controls, subsidies, and taxes. And then after that, in chapters 9, 10, and 11, 9, 11, and 12, will be, no, sorry, I messed that up again. In chapters 9 and 11, we'll be looking at some additional market structures where we relax some more of the assumptions that we've made for the perfectly competitive model.